Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. This is Bassam Haddad. I am delighted to be here with Johnny Mansour, who will be addressing a very important topic that we have been planning for quite some time. Present Absent 1948 Palestinians, under the subtitle The Silencing of Palestinian Citizens of Israel During the War on Gaza. And this is a series. It is going to start with Adi, who is an attorney that I will be introducing in just a second. But let me first also say, as usual, this is the 22nd teach-in under the rubric of the Gaza in Context collaborative teach-in series. This is our first installment of Present Absent. The second installment will take place this Thursday at 1 p.m. as well, and it will be with Diana Butu, who is also a lawyer and will be addressing conditional citizens. I am now going to introduce Adi, but before everything, Adi, كيفك? How are you? Let me unmute you. That's my fault. Go ahead.
Salamat, Bassam, and everybody who's with us on this live broadcast. And hopefully it will be thoughtful and we'll be able to discuss the different topics.
Very much looking forward to it. So are a lot of people who are joining and are planning to watch if they cannot join us right now. Let me start by sharing a few words about Adi. Johnny Mansour holds an LLB in law and a BA in political science from Tel Aviv University. During his studies, he served as a teaching and research assistant. He is also a founding member and activist of the Haifa youth movement, and he served as the head of Al Muntada, the Arab Law Students Forum at Tel Aviv University. Upon completing his studies, Adi clerked in the National Public Defender's Office in the field of criminal and administrative law. Adi joined the Adalah Legal Center, the famous Adalah Legal Center, as a staff attorney in 2021. He will be discussing with us today the topic of silencing of Palestinian citizens in Israel during this onslaught on Gaza. Adi, I will give you the floor and then I will have a few questions for you. And depending on the time, we will actually have other questions from the audience that I will try to field. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bassam. So we are having this talk, and we cannot ignore the fact that the war is still ongoing on Gaza, and the genocide is still unfolding with thousands of people who have been deliberately killed or injured, who have been forced to leave their homes, who are facing ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And we are facing one of the most crazy, radical wars that we've ever seen in modern history. And this eventually is the frame that we are living in reality that has become very different in Palestine following the 7th of October and the war that was declared on Palestinians. When I say war declared on Palestinians, it's specifically not only on Gaza, because following the 7th of October, we've seen how the Israeli system has perceived Palestinians everywhere as the enemy, meaning that the state, with all its forces, has to face Palestinians on the different fronts, including within the state. Therefore, the state perceives Palestinians as the collective enemy. This is the start point towards Palestinians. This is the understanding of the relationship with the Palestinians. And this is the incentive of any act that is done against or in front of Palestinians. And within this framework, we've seen that following the 7th of October, there was a major crackdown on Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are also called Palestinians 48 or the inner Palestinians and so on. What started after the 7th of October was framed as the enemy within, meaning that the state and the state officials have looked upon Palestinians, citizens of Israel, citizens of the state, as the enemy from within, meaning the enemy that is living within us and inside us. From them, we have to be cautious, but also against them, we have to practice power, suppression, and control. Um, what has become as a military like rule and in reality of dystopia. We've seen the state performing a major crackdown specifically on free speech. Um, Now, this happens even before any Palestinian in 48 even starts or tries to mobilize in order to criticize and prevent the war. The act of the crackdown itself started from the presumption that there is an enemy from within. And this is a very important point that we need to talk about. And this is eventually the continuation of the way the state perceives its Palestinian citizens after the May 2021 events, the Dignity Uprising, but also the root causes or the root relations between the state and the citizens that is based on colonial relations and is based on control and power relations. Following the 7th of October, we've seen more than 300 arrests of people, activists, and so on for posting on social media. We've reached a high number, which we have never seen before, of more than 100 criminal charges of what is called incitement or sympathy with a declared terrorist organization. The Israeli framework, and we will discuss it later, uh, um, uh, also has within it a code or a rule, a law that is called the counterterrorism law, which is very broad. It's used many times against Palestinians in different aspects, also in free speech, but also in association organization. Famously, we know the case of the Palestinian Six were declared as terrorist organizations, also according to the counterterrorism law. Um, Aside from the mass arrests, we're also monitoring and representing in many cases of students who are facing disciplinary procedures for posts and expressions on social media. We're talking about 100, around 150, 160 cases of students where Adalah is representing around 100 students in more than 34 academic institutions. We're also talking about a complete ban on protests, any protest that is criticizing the war, or any protest that is trying to shed light on the massacres and the genocide that's happening in Gaza is perceived as a threat to national security and is even perceived as a support to terrorism, according to what the state perceives as terrorism. During which we've seen a crackdown on protests, prevention, suppression, arrests, and even filing criminal charges on the mere slogans that are said and chanted during the protests, which we have been chanting for dozens of years. We've also seen monitored and represented in job terminations of Palestinians um, in their workplaces. They were kicked out from their workplaces. There were prohibitions on them, and so on. Also for expressions and posting on social media. After the 7th of October, we've also witnessed bills that were proposed, but also laws that were accepted eventually. One of which is prohibiting the consumption of terrorist materials without any clear understanding or definition of what is terrorist materials. And this is eventually the shift from not only limiting freedom of expression, but preventing it altogether and moving towards criminalizing the thought of Palestinians, the mere thought and the mere existence and practice of Palestinians as Palestinians. And eventually, Bassam, this is the major framework that we are looking upon. Palestinians are facing persecution. They are facing charges merely for being Palestinian. They are facing disciplinary procedures for being Palestinian. And they are being brought in front of the courts, in front of the disciplinary procedures in the universities and the academia, in the workplaces, perceived as Arab Palestinians as the enemy and not as citizens. And this is a major shift, which of course has its roots within the racial discrimination system of Israel that has been practicing a system of apartheid and discrimination against Palestinians everywhere, but also within 48 and different laws and legal framework and the distribution uh, uh, um, of money and the distribution of power within the state, and also and specifically as we are witnessing now concerning freedom of expression.
Thanks, Adi. Let's move to a topic that you have been working on, and I know that is a major topic which many of us here, as also academics, not just as human beings, are interested in, and that is the topic of academic freedom, and particularly why did the silencing of Palestinian students become so central during the crackdown? In addition to, of course, professors, teachers speaking out, and then we can move to other groups. But there is a lot of interest in what is happening in the academic institutions, the various academic institutions, and specifically students.
Yeah. So what we've seen, Bassam, for the first time ever, honestly, uh, we've seen that universities have taken not only a stand during the war, but are taking an active part in suppressing and oppressing and also perceiving themselves as another front of the war. Meaning that academia in Israel and Israeli academic institutions, instead of protecting freedom of expression, instead of working on preserving the mere foundations of democracy that should be preserved and should be protected and should be encouraged. What we've seen is that academic institutions themselves have decided to take part in the oppression and in the suppression of free speech of Palestinians. As I've mentioned, we're talking about a huge number of cases. Now, if we were talking previously on zero cases before the 7th of October, now we're talking about 150, almost 160 cases of students who have posted expressions on social media. And this is one of our main legal arguments, by the way, is that all of the students posted these expressions uh, from their personal sphere with no connection whatsoever to the academic institution, from their personal social media accounts such as Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And suddenly the academic institution decides that it is going to enforce its disciplinary rules outside the territory of the academic institution itself, meaning that the institution perceives itself as extraterritorial, outside the territory that it sits in, not only physically but also virtually, to extend that to where the student is not practicing his academic life, but is mainly practicing his private life. And this shift is amazing because uh, um, we see that there is parallel enforcement that is happening. On one side, you have the enforcement of the police and the state attorney's office that are arresting people and prosecuting them and filing criminal charges. And on the other hand, at the same time, we are seeing disciplinary procedures that are happening against the same persons actually that are part of this institution where they are being accused also on that front as supporting terrorism and sympathizing with terrorist organization and so on. Of course, I will discuss how absurd these accusations are and how disconnected they are from reality. But this shift in itself presents the academic institutions as sub-state actors who take the state rules and the state structure, legal structure, decide to broaden it even further from how the state sees and perceives its own laws and applies it on students and how they perceive terrorism or how they perceive sympathy with the terrorist organization. If we look at the cases and the type of cases, to move maybe a little bit more from the abstract to the practical level, we see that we are facing cases of students who are posting ayah from the Quran, for example. We had cases of students who posted dua, a prayer to God. In a lot of cases, these prayers and these quotes from the Quran had nothing to do with the war on Gaza and had nothing to do with the attack on the 7th of October whatsoever. But still, what we have seen is that the academic institutions, they have the presumption that the student actually supporting terrorism or supporting a terrorist organization and so on. Of course, according to the declarations and the definitions of the Israeli legal system. Meaning that the perception is that he absolutely supports terrorism how we perceive it. He has to prove otherwise. And this is how we see that the burden has shifted, where the person is not innocent until proven guilty, but that he is guilty until he proves that he is innocent. He has to prove, for example, in the cases of the Quran, that posting the Quran on the 8th, on the 9th, and on the 8th, on the 10th of October, and later on, is not actually supporting Hamas. There is a presumption that is very much based on Islamophobia and based on racism, where the fact that you are posting something from the Quran is eventually violent, but is also supporting Hamas, and therefore we are going to force you into this humiliation of facing the university where you study in and having to explain that you do not support terrorism, you do not support violence, you do not support Hamas, and so on and so on and so on, even though it's clear from the evidence itself that you are not supporting any of the factions or any violent attacks and so on. We've also seen posts of challenging the general discourse that is in Israel. Now, this is very important to mention, is that since the war started, the amount of militarized speech where anything that is not supporting the war is perceived as a treachery or something that is against the state or supporting the enemy, meaning that the state, from the society, but also in the media outlets and within the government officials, there's a black and white understanding to what is considered a legitimate opinion, what is not considered a legitimate opinion. Therefore, we've also seen disciplinary procedures where students have to explain that actually criticizing genocide and criticizing the war crimes on Gaza is actually not a violation to the disciplinary rules. And we had cases where students actually, Bassam, were accused and eventually charged with being anti-Israeli and with supporting the enemy. Therefore, the academic institutions have set the bar so low, where even challenging the general discourse of supporting war crimes is seen as a crime itself. We've also seen cases of people who are expressing sympathy to the Palestinian people in Gaza. Of course, Palestinians in 48 are also Palestinians. There are cultural connections, language connections, national connections between Palestinians in 48 and Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and etc. And suddenly, any expression of sympathy towards Palestinians in Gaza is seen and perceived as also supporting the enemy, and raises suspicion by the institutions. And this has been said in front of us directly, that they are actually against Israel and they are supporting the enemy. Therefore, if we look at these examples, we see that these disciplinary procedures that previously were used specifically for students who are, for example, copying during an exam or are doing something that is violating the conduct of a student as a student, have turned and changed these rules into an allegiance test, basically charging the students with being the enemy, and they have to prove otherwise. Merely being Palestinian in front of these disciplinary procedures was perceived as supporting the enemy, specifically during times of war. We had cases of students who posted sympathy or they were sad on social media for the children that are dying in Gaza, that are being killed in Gaza. And they were accused and they were asked, how come do you post sympathy with Palestinian children and you do not post any sympathy with Israeli children? We raise, and it was told in front of us that these posts raise very hard questions as to what the student could do or could not do. Therefore, you become this continuous suspect. You have to prove each and every moment that you are innocent, that you are supporting the state, that you are not a traitor to the state, and so on and so on. And maybe to understand how problematic it is, we see that the accusations are not based on the legal structure that is problematic by itself. It's only based on the counterterrorism law or the criminal code and so on. The academic institutions analyze and understand the law however they see fit. And they understand it that if you, as a student, have posted something on social media and another student had his feelings hurt from that post, they have legitimacy and they have jurisdiction uh, um, uh, to bring you to a disciplinary procedure and to file charges against you. And this is maybe in a more general feeling, we see that um, the academic institutions, but also the state, through its different factions and enforcement agencies, have declared a monopoly on feelings, where only Israelis have the right to have feelings during the time of war. Palestinians are not allowed to have feelings. And if they have feelings, the only way these feelings could be legitimate is only if these feelings are directed towards Israelis and not towards Palestinians. And this is something very important. Maybe to look generally on how the Israeli public perceives this war is the total. It's also ignorance, but it's also the ability to blind yourself from what is happening in Gaza and to legitimize it in a militarized way and preventing any humanitarian understanding or human rights understanding to the situation that we are facing in Palestine.
Adi, you have been working in the courts, and every time we try to connect, and I try to call you, you're in the courts doing something.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're doing there. I'm joking. So you're in the courts constantly. Can you tell us what happens when somebody is charged, when a student is charged? Can you take us through an example of what actually happens? What is the approach to these charges? You said something about how matters of conduct get catapulted into matters of national security, and it's actually refreshing in a very sad way to hear that also where you're at in Israel, the question of feelings trumps everything else, as we say in some of the literature we've been producing. My feelings trump your genocide, basically. It's something that we encounter here in the United States, whereby words and pictures and scarves end up actually being tantamount to genocide at the same time that an actual genocide is taking place. So, how do these things get carried out? These charges get carried out in court. What is the approach to these charges, and how do you respond? And if you can just take us through the scenario.
So yeah, Bassam, what is really fascinating about the manifestation of feelings is that you see that eventually it's an attempt to rationalize an irrational act. It's trying to rationalize the act of revenge, which in itself is not rational in the understanding of a state, a nation state, or any act of an army. And feelings come in hand really quickly in order to legitimize and rationalize an act of war which is only built on an act of revenge. Um, and this eventually moves from the war that is happening in Gaza to the courtroom. We see that the same discourse that the soldiers are living or the soldiers are acting upon in Gaza continues straight into the courtroom by the state prosecutor, by the police, and also in prisons by the wards and so on. I will give an example which I think is fascinating. Um, we have the case of a student um, who was arrested from her home. She was blindfolded. She was taken to the police station. She was interrogated with, tortured, shouted upon. She was threatened, and so on and so on. She was arrested on free speech charges. She was arrested on posts on social media. Um, and she stayed in prison for around 2 3 weeks. Eventually, she was released within the swap deal between Hamas and Israel. Just imagine a student studying in a university was arrested for 2 3 weeks only for posting stories on Instagram. Okay, it's unprecedented in the idea that never have people posting on social media have been arrested for so long, especially not students or normative people. And eventually, she was released from the during the swap deal that happened. During her time in prison, she faced a reality that honestly it cannot be imagined, and it's very hard for me to even describe the the amount of, honestly, it's torture, it's the verbal assault and the physical assault on the prisoners, and also on female prisoners, which was very present since the 7th of October. More than 70% of the arrests happened to females as opposed to males. Eventually, she was released. After she was released, she receives a letter from her university saying that we are opening in disciplinary procedures. And the reason for opening the disciplinary procedures is for two things, two topics. One, for your posts on social media, even though the same posts were acquired by the university previously, and they decided that these posts do not amount to supporting a declared terrorist organization. But the main charge of the student is that she was released within the swap, meaning that an act that she was not responsible to, an act that was decided, by the way, by the Israeli government, they have decided on the list itself. She was released during that, and now she is facing disciplinary charges only for being released from prison in a situation where, in a different or a parallel reality, she would have never entered prison altogether. Meaning that, and this is what we've seen, that the state conducted arbitrary arrests against students, activists, and so on. And eventually, these same people were released during the swap, and it's some kind of black stain that is going to remain with them until the end of days, where they are losing their jobs and they are losing their education and so on. Um, and maybe if we look at this case, we see how the criminal procedure and the disciplinary procedure come hand in hand together, and we see how the universities with the prosecutor both attack and suppress the same student, both at the same time and both separately, for things that they have not they didn't do, and in our opinion, legal opinion, not in any way are these violation of free speech and so on. And in the hearings themselves, I will start with the hearings of the students in the disciplinary procedures in the academic institutions, and later maybe move to the hearings in the courtroom. We see the amount of hostility towards the students. We see how the prosecutors with the judges in the university, which are professors, of course, they give the impression of a united front against the student. And in many cases, we've even felt the hostility towards the lawyers themselves. And of course, asking the very famous questions, do you condemn or don't you condemn? Even the lawyers are asked these questions when they are professionally representing the students. Therefore, even the lawyers are perceived as Palestinians and not as lawyers in the hearings. And this in itself just shows how much those procedures are built inherently on racism and oppression. What was also very evident in the hearings, Bassam, is how much there was a lack of due process. Not almost 50 to 60% of the cases that we've represented in, students have been temporarily suspended, and some were actually permanently suspended even before having an actual hearing. We had cases of between 10 to 15 students who have been kicked out entirely from their studies through one letter accusing them of supporting terrorism. They didn't have any chance to protect themselves. They didn't have a chance to give any kind of arguments in front of the disciplinary committee and so on. They were facing this Kafkan reality, or the Kafkan court, where you are accused of supporting terrorism or accused of supporting Hamas or supporting the 7th of October and so on. You don't know why you are accused like this. You don't know what is the evidence. You have no idea how to protect yourself and what to say, and you have to face the reality that this is it. And eventually, in the procedures that are very similar to McCarthyism, and in their essence, we see that Palestinian students have shifted from students to the enemy within the academia, which the academic institution suddenly becomes this political institution. Not to say that it wasn't political before that, but we see how the institutions themselves have turned into this sovereignty, where into the sovereign, sorry, where they prosecute students, decide on their future, but also have the ability to go outside their borders and to accuse the students during their personal time and during their personal sphere. During the hearings, we've raised a lot of arguments against the legitimacy of these procedures themselves. One of our main arguments is that these procedures are flawed by the mere fact that they are based on racial discrimination. Since the war started, I was speaking about 150, 160 cases. We haven't seen even one case of a Jewish Israeli student who has incited against Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, or any Jewish Israeli student who has called for genocide, or has called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. Not even one has faced a disciplinary procedure within the university or within the college, meaning that the academia has not only put limits by itself on free speech, but has decided and defined what free speech is. And it's a very clear distinction. Free speech to Palestinians is not only limiting freedom of expression, it's using the limits of free speech in order to control and to oppress and to prevent freedoms, to prevent the right to education, to prevent the right to due process, and so on. As for Jewish Israelis, the limits of free speech are the limits of free speech by definition, nothing more than that. But what's more than that is that they are never used. The amount of racial discrimination, both in universities and colleges, and also in courtrooms, is so clear. But at the same time, anytime that you raise this argument, you are facing the reality where they tell you there is nothing to do. This is the reality. Um, but the reality eventually tells you that the perception of the state, of the academic institutions, but most importantly of the society, is that calling for genocide, calling for ethnic cleansing, incitement to violence against Palestinians are not perceived as crimes. They are not perceived as crimes. And therefore, whenever a Palestinian tries to talk that these are crimes and that you are not charging these people with criminal charges or with disciplinary charges, he is faced with the argument that these are not the same cases. They are the same cases, but honestly, in many cases, in most of the cases, the incitement to war crimes is much worse than other posts, which, in our opinion, fall within the limits or the protections of freedom of expression that should be protected within the society. Um, we see eventually that the difference is not within the post or not within the case, but within the person. And this is the main difference, that when an Israeli enters the courtroom, he is seen as an individual. When a Palestinian enters the courtroom, he is seen as a Palestinian. And this maybe brings me back to the courtroom and how reality is seen within the courtroom. We see that um, judges have rationalized the reality of the war, but have also shifted the reality of the war to the individuals. And maybe I'll give an example. Following the 7th of October and with the 300, 400 arrests, most of the cases have come to judges and with a request to extend the arrest of the person or the individual. And in almost all the cases, the arrest was extended until the end of the proceedings. Now, usually, the arrest until the end of proceedings is used in very major crimes, uh, um, major crimes like killing and so on. We're talking about cases where there is no element of violence in them, only the element of expression, which eventually any judge that has a brain within his head knows that you could limit this person eventually outside the prison. You can limit his access to social media, his access to the internet, and so on and so on. But there was a decision to extend the arrest of all these people until the end of proceedings without any clear danger that is coming from them as individuals. On the contrary, their arrest was rationalized and was legitimized based on the war itself. The argument of the prosecutor and the argument that was accepted by judges, many judges, is that because of the situation, we cannot release this person. Because of the war, we cannot release this person. Therefore, despite the fact that none of the people who got arrested and none of the students that got arrested took any part in the 7th of October, they are seen and perceived as the continuous as a continuous reality of what has happened, what in the Israeli perception continues to happen, and therefore they are seen as the enemy that we have to arrest, we have to keep in prison, we have to prevent and move away from society. And as I've mentioned on the specific student that was in arrest, almost all of the people who got arrested, from activists, from students, and so on, have faced very harsh situations and conditions that amount to war crimes and amount to torture. Many people have been starved in prison. Many people have been forced to be awake and not sleep. They were forced to move all the time. They were not given any coats. They were forced to sleep in very harsh, cold conditions, and so on and so on. Not to mention the physical attacks and the verbal attacks and assaults on prisoners. All this eventually has created an atmosphere of fear for Palestinians. And maybe, Bassam, here we move a little bit to the realization of what this means, what all of this means, and why did
Yeah.
the state
But
start all these problems. Yeah.
as you move on to the implications of all of this, before you do that, I'd like to ask you, what is the reason, or is there a particular reason why women were arrested at a higher rate? You're saying 70% of the arrested students are women. Is it a point that's being made by the Israeli authorities, or is it the actual behavior of, you know, women and their protests and so on?
So, but some honestly, we don't have a real explanation, not by the state or anyone, but also we have failed to understand really why specifically the amount of arrests of women and of females. Um, it could be to create this um atmosphere of intimidation. The arrests have happened where you see very huge amounts of police officers coming to the house of the student or the activist or whatsoever, breaking into the house, um, creating this blockade around the house where they search the house and its surroundings. They blindfold the woman and they put her in the car and so on. Um, Therefore, it could be that the state had decided to, within this crackdown, to create this atmosphere of fear within the society, where you don't know what will happen, when will it happen, and who will be the victim of the act. Um, Eventually, it's interesting that basically there were the swaps or the exchange of prisoners and hostages. And during these, most of the people who got released are actually people who were arrested and not convicted prisoners that were arrested following the 7th of October, which could be eventually another explanation to the amount of arrests.
All right. So sorry I interrupted you, but I'll let you move on to addressing the implication of all of what you have addressed, and maybe the bigger picture, or what might we expect next.
Yeah. If we look at the bigger picture in all of this, a lot of months have passed, Bassam, since the 7th of October, during one of the longest wars, maybe the longest, that Palestinians have faced in the last 20, 30 years. Um, we see that what happened to Palestinians in 48 is creating a reality of a military like rule, a dystopian reality, where the feeling is that you are being monitored all the time, you are being surveilled all the time. Um, and maybe this is a point that I didn't touch upon previously, Bassam. In most of the cases of the students, but also in the cases of activists who got arrested and so on, the people who informed the police were either their colleagues or people who are monitoring them on social media. And this is very important to say. Um, this is very different from the usual crackdown that we know. Usually, we understand the crackdown as the state, um, through its authorities, monitors and arrests and prosecutes Palestinians. What we've seen now after the 7th of October is that the society itself and the Israelis that are either living, working, or studying with Palestinians, they themselves had decided to complain and to start campaigns, media campaigns against students and activists, basically creating a lot of pressure in order to arrest these students and activists and to prevent them from going back to their studies or going back to their regular life. And this is a situation where um, the state, following the 7th of October, have created a reality of us against them, where Palestinians are perceived as I mentioned, the enemy, where the enemy doctrine is very strong and very evident in the acts of the state authorities, and eventually leading or formulating this dystopian reality where you have heard that your neighbor was arrested for posting, um, one of your relatives has been in prison for a couple of months. Um, you hear that someone who went or tried to protest was arrested for 2 3 months for only protesting against the war. You enter this reality of fear and intimidation where even the ability to think and criticize the war becomes disrupted by the fear and the intimidation that was forced upon from the state and from the society itself. Now, why do we talk a lot about students, and why has this subject become so central? For Palestinians in 48, following the Nakba, uh, acquiring education, academic education, has been a key factor or a shift factor for them in the reality. Palestinians, following the Nakba, have lost everything, following the ethnic cleansing of more than 530 villages and cities and towns. The society, but also the civil society, has been put into shatters and has remained without any leadership, without any structure whatsoever. And therefore, as Palestinians in 48, we have always learned from our parents who have learned from their grandparents. You have to study. This is the main tool for to survive. And as we Palestinians describe it, for sumud, in order to remain and to be steadfast on your land, in your life, to protect yourself, your family, and your reality, you have to go and study. You have to go and acquire academic education, and through that, you will be able to survive. Suddenly, we see that the only thing that Palestinians in 48, or one of the main things that Palestinians in 48 have managed to protect, but also and preserve, but also uh, uh, to increase the amount of people who are receiving education, academic education, and so on. We see that the major point of Palestinians in 48, is under attack. And when this is under attack, and from the generational trauma of Palestinians in 48, we see how the majority of the society becomes afraid and intimidated to even speak or criticize the war, or to speak against Israel, or to speak against the war crimes. Therefore, we see a shift from a situation where Palestinians in 48 are talking about a colonial citizenship, or are talking about Class B citizenship, or talking about a reality where their citizenship is formulated on power relations. We see a shift where the defense mechanism of Palestinians is even broader than that, talking about protecting not only the citizenship and the status that you have in the country, but also the existence in the country, because eventually the education is so perceived and so interconnected with your existence that merely protecting it becomes a high value, and eventually you understand that you have to keep a low profile in this reality, because otherwise to either lose your education or get arrested. But in any way, you are going to face consequences for either criticizing the war, talking about the reality in Palestine, in many cases quoting the Quran, and expressing any religious expressions, challenging the discourse, and so on. And this is why Bassam education and and the silencing of Palestinians in education have become so pivotal in the reality of Palestinians in 48. And the main talking point in any house that you enter, from the north to the south, in the Galilee, in the Jalil, in the Naqab, and so on, in the cities. This is the main subject that people are talking about. Um, and surveys that have started in the last couple of months show that more than 70% of Palestinian students feel that they are being monitored. More than 60% have faced incitement and have faced racism. And the vast majority of students are thinking about leaving their studies um, with no possible reality or no possible future whatsoever.
Thanks, Adi. Before I ask you to say a little bit about Adalah, and what its work constitutes, and how you're involved and how others are involved, can you tell us a little bit about the variance from October 8th until today in terms of these arrests or the general atmosphere of fear? I understand that people feel that they're living under a like a dictatorship in relation to prior to October 7th, in the sense that people could speak out, could, use Facebook, social media, say things. We've actually, experienced this and have seen it. But after October 8th, it seems to be a situation where, it's uh, almost totally fascistic. Has it changed since October 8th, or has it been constant?
You mean Bassam before October
No,
8th was
from October
reality?
8th until today. Like, has is it getting worse, or is it subsiding, or is it the same?
We've been asked this question a lot, Bassam, but the thing is, because we talked about the amount of fear and intimidation, it's hard to decide if everybody shut up or that the state is actually uh, has become less or less oppressing to Palestinians. Because after 2 months of arrests and disciplinary charges and procedures that are still going on, and criminal charges and cases that are ongoing until today. And we have cases in courts almost every day on incitement, charges of incitement, and so on, which are criminalizing the Palestinian speech. Um, Basically, what has happened fall immediately after the 7th of October, after the 8th of October, is creating this reality where you are not able to protest, you are not able to criticize, you are not able to do this and do that. But eventually, we do have examples that show us that the reality actually didn't change. Following the 7th of October, there has been a number of attempts to organize protests. And the police would come and say, you are not allowed, you are prohibited to protest. Um, Eventually, in Adalah, we went even to the Supreme Court on this. And we argued that there is no need to ask for a license for a protest anyway, according to the Israeli law. But still, we asked the court to allow the protest to happen and to prevent the suppression of the protest by the police. However, the Supreme Court, in more than one occasion, more than one case, have took the stand of the police, and it's very actually very interesting, and it's funny, the arguments of the police. They say that they don't have enough manpower to protect the protest that is happening. Okay, they say that we are very busy with the war, we cannot protect the protest, and therefore this protest is not allowed. But how do they say it? They say that we need very large amounts of manpower uh, to protect the public order if the protest is happening in Sakhnin or Arabi or Nazareth, for example. Meaning that indirectly they are saying that for us to protect the public order of these protests, because they are happening in Palestinian towns, we need very large amounts of manpower, and therefore we cannot allow this protest to happen. Now, in reality, we had an example where the leadership of Palestinians through the High Follow Committee have decided to declare a protest. The police immediately said, "You cannot protest on this day. We are going to make arrests. We're going to prevent the protest." Now, secretly, not officially, the High Follow Up Committee decided we are not going to have the protest on that day. We'll have it later, but we will not declare. Now, it was a Saturday, and if you have come to during that Saturday to the downtown of Nazareth, you would see huge amounts of police officers with batons on horses, with tear gas, stun grenades, everything, ready to suppress the protest that was supposed to happen. And this gives you the answer that they do have the manpower, but they don't have the manpower to protect the protest. They have the manpower to suppress the protest. And until today, protests are being prevented. Protests criticizing the war, protests of calling out what is happening as a war crime or calling it out as a genocide. This is still going on. Cases of students are still going on. Arrests are still happening, even though the amount is much less. But as I mentioned, Bassam, it's either they manage to suppress us, or that I guess there's no one left at this point.
All right. Before I keep yeah, inserting other questions, if you don't mind. So a lot of people
Sure.
are listening to this, and they are assuming, or we are all assuming. Of course, this is horrendous, generally speaking. But there are people who don't fully realize, and especially those who are quote unquote just entering into this realm of Israel Palestine in a more profound way, who do not realize that we are not experiencing this, or people in Palestinian citizens of Israel are not experiencing this simply as a function of what happened on October 7th and after, but there is an atmosphere prior and for decades, of course, that defines what Arab slash Palestinian citizenship means in Israel. And that is, in and of itself, something to address and discuss as opposed to as something that is akin to a second class citizenship at the most, uh, given that in the mainstream, there are arguments that are proliferating since October 7th that Palestinian citizens of Israel are enjoying all of the freedoms historically that Jewish Israelis are. So, can you address that and how that becomes exacerbated?
Yeah. So yeah, there is this assumption or this unrealistic thought that Palestinian citizens of Israel are living in heaven. You know, they are living in this democratic state where everything is amazing, and everybody has their rights and so on. There is this famous saying among Palestinians, citizens of Israel, is that the state is democratic for Jewish Israelis, but is Jewish to Palestinians. And this maybe sums up the identity of the state and its relationship with Palestinians. Officially, the state declares itself, of course, as a Jewish and democratic state, uh, um, but eventually, in its reality, it's a state that practices apartheid and therefore cannot be democratic for Palestinians or for when you're talking about a system, the system itself cannot be described as democratic when it's built upon systematic racial discrimination against Palestinians. Um, and the Jewishness of the state has built or has been built upon a systematic Jewish supremacy, where Jewish Israelis are superior to Palestinians anywhere between the river and the sea. And maybe specifically to talk about the citizenship, they are superior to Arab Palestinians, citizens of Israel. And this, if we to talk about maybe in a more legal or political understandings, this is also evident within the rules and within the laws of the country. Um, Palestinians, while Palestinians have the right of return, this right is prevented to Palestinians and they are prevented from returning to their land. At the same time, there is a law of return for Jewish Israelis, for Jews. Sorry. So any Jewish person from anywhere in the world, from Europe, from the US, and so on, they can come and live in Israel and acquire citizenship from the state. Now, if we're still talking about the citizenship and the status, we can even look on the law that is prohibiting or putting a ban on family unification of Palestinians. And we understand how the core essence of citizenship and constitutional rights is a reality of racial discrimination. Following the Second Intifada in 2002 2003, the Israeli Knesset passed a law banning family unification of Palestinians, meaning that if you are a Palestinian from 48, يعني within the borders, within the 48 borders, if you want to marry a Palestinian from the West Bank, for example, or from Gaza, you are not allowed to marry this person and live with him or with her in the same household inside the borders of the state. Meaning that your right to family life, your right to live with your spouse is prevented by the law itself. And if we look at the other direction of it, Palestinians eventually are not allowed or are prevented from acquiring citizenship through marriage, while Israelis have both abilities, either to marry a foreigner who is not Jewish and that person can acquire citizenship, or a Jewish person can move to the country and acquire citizenship. And therefore, citizenship in its essence, and the law banning family unification, is the manifestation of apartheid in citizenship. It's built in its essence on apartheid and racial discrimination, where Palestinians have a different route for citizenship, which is either limited or prevented. And for Jewish Israelis or for Jewish people, it's allowed and also encouraged to acquire citizenship. Now, maybe to understand, even delve a little bit deeper, and this is an example following the 7th of October, one of the proposed bills in the Knesset today is to provoke to end or to terminate the citizenship of the revocation of citizenship of Palestinian citizens of Israel when it comes to posting on social media and when they are facing charges of incitement to terrorism and supporting terrorism. Therefore, one of the discussions today in the Knesset is the revocation of the citizenship of Palestinians for posting on social media. Now, the revocation of citizenship is also not new. In the last 20 years or so, a couple of rules have been passed, a couple of laws have been passed that allow the revocation of citizenship and residency to Palestinians, allows the state to revoke your legal status, to prevent your basic rights that you were born with. And by the way, it's important to stress that Palestinians they did not choose the Israeli citizenship. Eventually, they are the ones who remained within what has become the state of Israel following the Nakba, and they were given citizenship as part of the recognition of the state of Israel. But eventually, we see that the state, especially in the last 20 years, where we see that fascism has become enrooted within the state, and where we see that the amount of discrimination has reached levels that have never been so high, many laws have been passed in order to revocate the citizenship based on the perceptions of the enemy or the friend. Therefore, the relationship that we were talking about, the relationship of us against them, which was enrooted after 48, the let's say the constitutional moment or the constitutional realization within Israel, which has built the relations or the social contract, let's say, was built on the idea that Israelis are the social contract, or they are building the social contract of the state, and they are the citizens, while Palestinian citizens of Israel are the enemy, and therefore they have lived under military rule for 20 years following 48, and that same military rule has remained in its structure and its idea until today, and how I've mentioned within the reality that we are living following 48, following the military rule. But specifically now, if we look at the reality following the 7th of October, this reality could have never happened without the systematic repression and oppression of Palestinians by the state in the last more than 70 years. I hope this answered the question.
Absolutely, absolutely. It takes a minute to take it all in. Um, Adi, we kept you. I kept you longer than I anticipated. I keep saying this every time we have one of these teachings because a lot comes up and it's always very important. Can you close first of all before you close with telling us a little bit about Adala and the work of Adala, and potentially the pressures Adala is under the current circumstances. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our particular topic on silencing Palestinians in this current moment before we close?
Yeah. Uh, so, yeah, I think during the last hour we managed to touch upon most of the subjects. Of course, we're talking about um, so many details that have surfaced in the last couple of months following the war. But maybe one of the major issues to think about is the future, maybe following these procedures and this crackdown on Palestinians. Um, the ability to see a future where mobilization and activism returns. And of course, we all know how important student activism is and how important, and their major part, criticizing this war specifically worldwide. Um, just to imagine and maybe to think about the future for Palestinian citizens of Israel in academic institutions. And maybe this is why it's very important to raise awareness and to talk about the crackdown and the silencing of Palestinians everywhere. It's important to talk about these subjects, and it's important to emphasize the amount of arbitrariness that we see in these procedures. And eventually, the role of Adala has been during this war, but also previously, is not only to represent and during this war to give legal aid, but it's also to challenge the discourse. It's to challenge the reality, the legal and the political reality of Palestinians, and also importantly to raise awareness and to advocate for the rights of Palestinians everywhere, and specifically the rights of Palestinians in 48. And Adala, in its mandate as a legal center, it's a Palestinian legal center that represents Palestinians everywhere. Um, a legal center that takes part in legal challenges concerning the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, 48, and so on, um, through three different aspects that, of course, a lot of time coincide and unite together. We work in political and civil rights. This is the department I work in within Adala, focusing on the right to representation, the right for free speech, for protests, and so on and so on. Of course, within that, we've also worked and um, in the last two years, or in the last year or so, we've worked extensively on the case of the Palestinian Six, organizing the legal team of the Palestinian Six, and um, um, giving our legal challenges or presenting our legal challenges in that case. Um, we've also work in social and economic rights, arguing and challenging the discrimination in education and in health services and so on. And of course, one of our main units is the land and planning unit, where we work extensively on the right to land and ownership, and the right for equal planning within cities, municipalities, and so on, but also protecting and challenging the situation of unrecognized villages in the Naqab, which face very harsh discriminatory reality by the state, where they are forced to be displaced and forced to leave their homes and their houses by the state. Now, maybe this is an overview of Adalah, the legal organization that has been working and representing Palestinians since the 90s, and hopefully, inshallah, we continue on doing that with our legal colleagues and with many colleagues from the Palestinian civil society organizations and internationally, the organizations that we work with. And maybe an end note on this. And during the time where I think everybody is watching the news extensively each and every day, and taking part or trying to take part in any way possible. Um, um, Palestinians, following the 7th of October, if we look at Gaza, the West Bank, 48, Jerusalem, and so on, all the elements of oppression that we have faced since 48 have resurfaced, and let's say have become more abrupt in their manifestation in reality. We see the crackdown on Palestinians in 48 and the prevention of free speech. We see the war crimes, the ethnic cleansing, the displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. We see also the extensive military rule in the West Bank, the killing of Palestinians in the West Bank, the mass arrests that are happening, and the prevention of also political participation, administrative detention, and so on. In Jerusalem, we are also witnessing a reality where Palestinians are prevented from entering Al-Aqsa, where their phones are being searched on checkpoints, and so on and so on. Therefore, what we see in the reality today, and of course this is not new, and as you've mentioned, Bassam, this is the reality that Palestinians have been living through extensively, in what is seen even legally as the ongoing Nakba, where the system itself is built on the continuous forced displacement and discrimination of Palestinians in everywhere, in any place that they are existing in. It's important for all of us to raise the awareness on what's happening in Palestine, to talk about what is happening to Palestinians, to criticize the war crimes that are happening, and to take our role legally, politically, and actively to prevent and to challenge and to raise awareness on the discrimination, the oppression of Palestinians, and mainly to call, and this is the most important, to call for the protection of Palestinians, and inshallah, the end of this war and the ceasefire of this war.
Thanks, Adi. This was very insightful. I really appreciate it. We all do lots of great comments on various platforms on how valuable this was, because it's an area that people assume, even though they know the basics, but this was basically prying it open and giving us a cross-sectional view of a number of details, of very important details that will actually equip us to learn more and be able to address this matter when it comes up. Thank you very much again. We are doing this as a series. It's not a one-time teach-in under the title Present Absent 1948 Palestinians. This is part one. We were graced by your presence. This time, we are moving to a couple of other convenings and teach-ins. Let me just show very quickly. The next one will be this Thursday at 1 p.m. with Diana Butu, and it's titled Conditional Citizens. It'll be at 1 p.m. EST, 8 p.m. Palestine. And next week, we have a panel, actually, mostly from Palestine, on the same topic, which addresses various dimensions, including historical dimensions, as well as various dimensions in time and space, addressing the um, conditions of Palestinians living in Israel for the most part. Adi, again, thank you very much. We kept you for 80 minutes now. I hope that we have not shortchanged the people that you are defending and supporting where you're at in Haifa, I presume. We will speak with you again if you have the time. Hopefully, under better circumstances. One keeps saying they cannot get worse, and they keep getting worse. So we'll just brace and brace for impact, especially what might be impending in the coming days, even more than what we are witnessing today. Shukran, Adi. Be safe and all power to you. So many people are appreciative of what you do and know full well the conditions under which you're operating. So, thank you.
Shukran, Bassam. Thank you for having me. And I personally really appreciate the series and this amazing idea of talking about the reality of Palestinians, to raise awareness, especially talking about Gaza in context. This is what we need. This is the education about this topic is something very important and very one of the main elements, specifically during times of war. And I hope that I didn't take too much time of you or from our the listeners that are with us that are hearing and watching us, and inshallah to have better days.
Shukran, no, بالعكس, on the contrary, we really appreciated it. And I wanted to also thank the uh, 2 dozen institutions and organizations that collaborate with us to produce these teach-ins and these activities. You can actually find out more at any point on palestineincontext.org, which is our uh, portal that includes all of the teach-ins, the podcasts, as well as other events that we're holding. And all of the videos actually will be found there. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Adi, for your time. And we hope to see you again soon. Thursday, actually. Salam.